All right. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah from Welocalize. Today I am joined by Carsten, who is the Director of Localization at Smartsheet. And recently Carsten, went through the RFP process and what that buying process looks like. And so we wanted to do just a short chat together to talk a little bit about his experience and some of his learnings from that, so that hopefully it'll help other buyers out there. Carsten, you've been in the industry for, quite some time. I don't want to age you here, but do you want to give just a little bit of background about your experience, before we dive into the process?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's great to talk about this little story here and this little journey. So a little bit about myself. Well, I've been around for quite some time, I would say, 20 plus years in the loc industry, different roles at different companies. But I think the key here is I've been on both the client and the vendor side. So I know both sides of the equation. The last 10 years, I've been in leadership roles, started at the time when I was at Microsoft, headed up the localization team there. And then fast forward to last year, there was this unique opportunity at Smartsheet to really build something from the ground up. So Smartsheet has been around for quite some time, but international was sort of like, I don't want to say not important, because international is always important, but they were at a point in time when they wanted to take localization to the next level. And, at the time, they really started investing in international. So that's when I came on board with the mission, basically to take localization to a new level.
Yeah, and I kind of remember that a little bit in reading the RFP, that, leadership was ready to really go all in on international.
Yep.
Awesome. So before we dive into some of the details on the RFP process and what you learned from it and kind of how you ran it, I did think it might make sense to just talk a little bit about our companies and introduce who we are. So just a little bit of background on our two companies. So Welocalize is a language services provider. We are celebrating our 25th year in business this year. We are what we consider a full service multi-vertical LSP. So what that means is that we offer a variety of different language services that are really meant to help our customers at every stop of their global journey. So we cover 250 languages and over 525 language pairs. In my almost 4 years here, I still haven't run into a scenario where there's a language that we can't support. And we have 2,300 global employees, which really helps us to be able to provide follow the sun support for our customers. So another little random fact here is that we translate over 2.1 billion words per year. We consider, obviously translation our bread and butter of our business. So that's a little bit about Welo. Carsten, you want to introduce us to Smartsheet?
So I'm not going to talk too much about the Smartsheet product itself. We could probably fill like a whole day talking about that. So just some highlights here. Smartsheet has actually been around for quite some time, which, to be honest, I wasn't aware of before I joined the company. But Smartsheet was actually founded in 2005, so quite some time ago. Yeah. Of course, very small for many years. To summarize our product portfolio, so we are what we consider a modern work management system, and there's a whole bunch of tools out there in that space. Obviously, we like to think of ourselves as leaders in that space, and we really, when we think about our story, we are about impacting lives of not only individuals, but also, companies of all different sizes and of all different backgrounds. So today, Smartsheet is actually present in, I would say, all kinds of companies that you can think of, from what it says in the slide here, the small nonprofit organization, the small mom and pop shop, and all the way to the, Fortune 500 companies.
Yeah.
So if you can quickly go to the next slide. I couldn't fit everything on one slide, just a few hard facts. Today, we're actually more than 3,000 employees, growing rapidly over the last 2 years, especially. We have customers all around the globe. That doesn't mean, we're available in every single language when we think about localization here.
Getting there.
But we do have, customers basically all over the globe. We are headquartered in the state of Washington, in Bellevue. We do have 2 additional offices in the US, in Boston and Denver. And then we started expanding internationally. First, we had an office in Australia and the UK, both in England and Scotland. We recently opened an office in Costa Rica, and we also, actually the materials are not updated here, but we also have people on the ground now in Japan and Germany.
Very cool.
So that's kind of the company at a glance. One thing to mention, so even though we have, physical office space in the US in those 3 cities, we are basically more or less fully remote. So people have the option, of course, to go to any of the offices, but we're mostly operating remotely.
Yeah, us too, especially since COVID.
Yeah. And just a few things. I could also go on and on and on about what a great company Smartsheet is, but it's evidenced by a few industry awards here that I just put on the next slide here. So pretty awesome place.
Thinking about the RFP process, what are some of those first steps that you took to begin that process and to kick it off? And before doing that, what are some things that a buyer in your shoes, maybe it's a localization manager, director of localization, should consider really to kind of get their ducks in a row before going to an RFP?
Yeah, the question is, where do we start, right? Well, I did take, I have to admit, I did take some notes prior to meeting here, so I don't forget anything. But
well, how about this? Let's start from the very beginning. You joined Smartsheet. What were some of those first things that you did prior to releasing an RFP that you did internally? I guess
yeah, that's a good start. So and actually, I was in a you could say unique / very good position, just starting out fresh at Smartsheet, because the first thing I thought would be necessary to do is to just look at the vendor portfolio at the time. There was a supplier in place, and what I saw is that supplier really hadn't been challenged at all. There was never like a full-blown RFP. Well, I don't want to say never, but there just hadn't been a formal RFP process for quite some time. And also, we didn't have like a rich portfolio of technology. So I thought, now I'm coming in and this is the perfect time to take a closer look at things. So I decided to go ahead with an RFP, of course, invite the incumbent vendor as well. And then I just wanted to look, basically, I wanted to shop around a little bit to see what's out there. So I think the first thing, going back to, the unique timing of this, me just starting out and then doing the RFP, it was, selfishly, it was a learning opportunity for me, because how do you go about, putting in your RFP requirements? Well, you need to make sure that you serve all the stakeholders that you work with. So for me, the first step was really get to know all the stakeholders, which is something I would have had to do anyway, but really talk to the stakeholders about their unique localization requirements so I could put those into the RFP process. That was the very first step.
And those stakeholders, they helped you. Did they help you with writing the actual document, or you more so just took your learnings from it to create the RFP document?
Yeah, not to sound lazy, but I made the stakeholders write up their own sections.
Okay.
Just because, I didn't need to be the middleman. And also I always envisioned stakeholders to be interacting with our future supplier. So
Yeah.
I thought this was a good first step for them to get them engaged in the process. The other thing I wanted to avoid is, obviously having been in the industry for quite some time, you've built up your network, you have your contacts at different companies. I didn't want to be in a position where, I would be the one making the decision. I wanted this to be a broad, stakeholder decision. And just by involving them early on at the very early stage of even writing up the requirements, I thought that was the best way forward.
Yeah. And you had looped in procurement through this process, correct?
Correct. So yeah, I worked closely with procurement, which was another thing for me being new at Smartsheet. It was a good opportunity for me to learn about their processes and their inner workings, right? Because, reality is every company has a procurement department, but every procurement department works differently, right? You have different tools, different processes, different people with different, motivation to help you. I found it very refreshing, actually, at Smartsheet. The level of engagement from the procurement folks was really great, I have to say.
Yeah, I can say just even on the vendor side, I do recall that procurement being involved in the process.
Yeah.
So that was definitely a benefit from our point of view. And I'll also add that, I loved that you guys had the stakeholders so involved in that process and really giving, detailed responses on what are our existing pain points, what are the content types that we're working on, where do we want to take this next year. Being the vendor side, that really helps. And that's something that I hope buyers take into consideration when putting together RFPs is the more detail that you can give, the more detail that a vendor can give, right? If we know what a buyer's pain points are, what they're looking for, we can really tailor a response that speaks specifically to those needs versus your, generic proposal that with canned responses that really aren't valuable to anyone. So that was one thing that stood out, from our point of view that I thought you guys really did a great job was getting into the weeds a little bit to talk a lot about the pain points and what you were looking for. So kudos to you guys on that. Now from there, can you just talk to us a little bit about, what were next steps from there? Once you had an idea of what each stakeholder was looking for, what their pain points were, how do you then decide, okay, these are the certain LSPs or vendors that we want to include?
Yeah, so good question. How do you decide who you actually invite to the process, right? Like, I mean, we know there's literally hundreds of providers out there, all different sizes, different portfolios, different offerings. So my objectives were to bring in a diverse set of suppliers. I kind of looked at it from like, I want to bring in the anything from thinking of t-shirt sizes, right? The small to the extra large and everything in between. That was important to me, just to look at different sizes of providers. And then, to be honest, it wasn't any scientific selection process. It was just like who I knew and who I had heard of in terms of providing good services to some of my industry peers. So we ended up with 5 suppliers being invited to the process, including the incumbent vendor.
Oh, great. And then when you invited these vendors, I guess what were the primary things that you were looking for in a partner? And then how did that translate to like a weighted scorecard on your side?
Yeah, I know this is very generic, but basically we needed a provider that can simply offer a wide variety of services. Going back to the stakeholder requirements, we had a lot of, you mentioned it, Sarah, a lot of different, not file types is the wrong word here, but different localization, different types of localization, right? There was anything from a simple text translation to a fully automated end-to-end continuous localization pipeline, and then everything in between, like video localization, other multimedia localization. So long story short, it needed to be a vendor who could provide a wide set of services.
Mm-hmm.
And then scale is important.
I do recall that sticking out, scalability from the
scalability. Yeah, somebody who's flexible enough to quickly scale up and down, for that matter, as needs change, right? Like we're the only constant nowadays is change, right? So that's kind of like what we're looking for in the invited suppliers. Like, are they operating in an agile fashion? I think that's the best expression I can come up with here. The other thing, what I remember also is, of course, there are some hard facts you can look at, pricing being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, pricing is important, right? We don't want to waste any money, but I think in the grand scheme of things, having been around for a while, I think pricing is very competitive, I would say. I don't think, going from vendor A to vendor B, you find large price differences. Okay, one vendor might be, 2 cents more for one certain language and 5 cents less for another. So pricing wasn't, I can say pricing wasn't the primary focus, just knowing that pricing would be very comparable.
Yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
I'll say just, I can see from my end in, doing this for a few years now, I think buyers are really becoming more and more aware now that the lowest price doesn't necessarily mean you're winning something, right? There's a human on the other end who needs, livable wages, and
exactly,
when knock the price down, that also puts quality at risk. So it is refreshing from our end to see that more and more buyers see that and understand that price can oftentimes equate to quality too. So one thing that I remember sticking out too from the RFP is something that you said early on, and it was that we don't want our content just translated. We want a truly localized experience. I recall you saying that that's really what you were looking for in a vendor too.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Exactly. Somebody who can really take, our product to market, not just do standard translation. We're really looking for transcreation services, and then also in-country, what's the right word here? In-country market research, right? Because we have obviously a lot of marketing content, and we needed to make sure with our expansion into, I mentioned Germany and Japan, the offices that we were just opening there, that also meant, providing more materials in those languages. And we know, the criticality of those markets, making sure you do it right the first time. Yeah.
What about technology? I know technology is going to be a big piece to any RFP.
I think that was sort of the other main pillar of the RFP, right? Like we had a lot of technology requirements.
Yeah.
And in a way that was also coincidental timing wise, because I was looking to bring in a TMS in-house at the same time. Prior to me joining Smartsheet, there was definitely a lot of opportunity to grow in the use of technology. Starting with just a basic TMS infrastructure. So at the same time, we were looking at localization services providers. We were also looking at TMS providers.
Yeah.
And then obviously, what was really important to us is that whoever we would end up selecting as a supplier was fully plugged in with, the whole TMS process, which I think, in all fairness, most suppliers are these days, at least when you look at the standard off-the-shelf TMS offerings.
Yeah. And if I recall, you were also looking for a vendor who was willing to plug into Smartsheet as well, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So, Smartsheet being an end-to-end, process / project management solution. Internally, obviously, we use Smartsheet for everything, right? Like every single project we manage, we run on Smartsheet.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to make sure that whatever we have in place in terms of Smartsheet infrastructure for localization project management, we could continue on with the future supplier.
Yeah.
So plugging whatever system they had on their side into Smartsheet was also something we had put into the RFP requirements document.
Yeah. Now, once you're going through the process, you've sent out this RFP to multiple vendors, you receive a first proposals back from vendors. What is the process of going through those? Like, what were you looking for as you're reading through proposals, and what made you say, okay, this one stands out. Maybe we want to prioritize these 2 or 3 vendors. What were you really looking for in that process?
So when the written proposals came back in, I think the main thing I was focusing on was, did the supplier really address all of the requirements from the RFP document? We had spent, we probably didn't emphasize that enough, but like involving all the stakeholders in writing up the requirements document, that document ended up being quite extensive, right? It was, I don't remember how many pages, and having all that input in there, we did that for a reason, right? It was a lot of work to get that document together, and I really wanted to make sure, after having put in all this work, that the suppliers really addressed what was in the document. There's a lot of, and I'm sure you guys have that too, you have a lot of generic, sales materials, and I didn't want to read a generic proposal that basically said we do localization. I'm exaggerating, but you get my point here.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Addressing the requirements was the most important thing, I would say. The other thing, sorry, Sarah, the other thing, we had a list of, we sort of had a questionnaire in the appendix with just some, again, that was all based on stakeholder input. We basically had a list of just questions about, they were categorized in terms of like about the company, about the services, about different things. So that was also important, that those questions get addressed very specifically, right? Not generic, specific. And last but not least, I had to look at my notes, sorry. There was also opportunity for the LSP to ask questions. Of course, maybe looking at the requirements doc, everything is clear to us, but somebody who doesn't know about Smartsheet, they might have some questions. So we also gave the different companies opportunities to ask questions. And I think I would say the quality of the questions say a lot about how interested a company was to get the business, basically.
Yeah, agreed. And I know we didn't talk about this before, so I hate to put you on the spot, but I do think it is valuable for a buyer that is in your shoes. Let's say you've been in the industry for a long time, so I think you know what to look for. But let's say this is somebody who's new to localization. It's their first time going through an RFP process and selecting a vendor. What are things that you would say are very important that that buyer should be looking for within a proposal from a vendor?
Yeah, so I think I keep going back to the requirements, but I think that's the centerpiece of any good RFP process, right?
Mhm.
So my message to other buyers is really put your requirements in writing, and make sure that's something the vendors you invite can work with. So
Yeah.
when the proposal comes back, just make sure they're very specific about how they address your needs, right? You don't need a generic sales pitch. You want specifics on how they address your issues. I
Yeah.
think that was my main takeaway. That would be my main recommendation for other buyers. Spend a lot of time up front and put your requirements together. It just makes everybody's lives easier.
Yeah. Yeah. And then from there, I know that once you had narrowed it down to a handful of vendors, your next step in the process was for vendors to be invited to present to all the different
Correct.
stakeholders.
Yeah.
So tell me, just based on Smartsheet's opinion, what were you guys looking for from vendors in those presentations? What were you hoping to see?
Yeah. So one thing we didn't mention, internally we had put together scorecards as well.
Hmm.
And the scorecards were for all the stakeholders to fill out throughout the process. One section of the scorecards was about the written responses.
Hmm.
And then the other section was about the yet to be done oral presentations.
Hmm.
So for the written part, it was what I mentioned before, addressing the requirements. For the oral part, it was just that as well, but maybe with a slightly different, more human touch, I would say, because when you look at the people who present to you, at least I picture myself, oh, these are the people I might be working with going forward. So is there a good connection with the people who present to
Yeah.
you? And keep in mind, it's probably like the sales force who you have in front of you. It's not necessarily the people that will be working with you on the ground later on. So I think one thing that made, I would say the winners in that process stand out was like, who did they put forward in the presentation? Was it
Yeah.
just really like a sales effort, or was it like an effort to almost like show you the potential future team you would be working with?
Anything else about presentations that really stood out to you that you thought, oh, this is great, or oh, I don't want to see that again, or things that, again, going back to my example before, first time buyers that they should look out for?
So again, addressing the requirements. Is it do you feel like it's an overall good fit?
Mhm.
And then of course, then the little extras come into play, right? Like how much effort do you feel like they put into the presentation? Again,
Yeah.
is it the generic sales pitch, or did they really go the extra mile to show you that they want your business, right?
Yeah.
And there's things to pay attention to, like, are they talking very generically about a TMS? Or are they really talking about how they would use the TMS within your current
Like,
environment? It's
yeah.
subtle things like that I would look out for.
Yeah.
And then again, the human factor, it feels a little bit like a job interview probably. And when I think of job interviews, I always think like, do I feel good about working with the folks I have in front of me? Does
Yeah.
it feel right?
Which is huge because, as you know, it's daily interaction.
Yeah,
Some,
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
sometimes
I think
several times a day. So if there's a personality clash,
exactly.
I could definitely see how that would be troublesome from a buyer
Yeah,
side. It's
yeah. And
essentially that,
the supplier becomes part of your extended team in the end, right? So look
yeah,
at the presentation as, are these almost like my future teammates who are presenting to me?
yeah. And then after the presentations were done, you guys obviously had a large team making the decision.
Mhm.
So can you just explain a little bit more on how Smartsheet arrived at a decision where you felt confident that it pleased everybody who was involved?
Yeah. Going back to the scorecards, right? And as I said at the very beginning, I never wanted to be in a position where I'm the one saying, okay, let's choose vendor A, vendor B. What I wanted to avoid is, any type of favoritism. And then any situation where people down the road would come back to me and point fingers at me saying, wow, you picked that vendor, see what a mess you put us in, right? Exaggerating, but I wanted this to be a team decision, getting all the stakeholders involved. I wanted to make sure everybody had skin in the game. So everybody had the opportunity to fill out their scorecards. Not everybody did, which is fine, but people had plenty of opportunity to voice their opinion. In the scorecards, it just had some categories that we deemed important, like technology. One thing we didn't touch on, quality, for instance, and the overall setup, if it felt like this could really help with bringing our business forward. So I don't want to say it was a complex scorecard, but it was a quite extensive scorecard, and it had some weighing in there and all that. So if you were diligently going through the process with us, reading the written responses, sitting through the orals, I think you were in a very good position to score in each of the categories. And then basically, I looked at who came out on top at the end of that scoring. And maybe fast forwarding a little bit here, we went then from the original 5 suppliers to the top 2 suppliers actually, and then with the top 2, obviously one was a little higher scoring in the scorecard, but we really wanted to zoom in on both of the top 2 suppliers and do some more in-depth analysis of their capabilities. And what we did there was we did some mock projects, basically.
Yeah, the mock project process. I remember that.
Yeah.
One thing that stood out to me too, with you involving multiple stakeholders in the decision, not only that it's kind of like a cover your own butt thing here, you have buy-in from all stakeholders. It's a group decision. It doesn't fall on one person. I also feel like that translates well to the onboarding process, because now you're meeting with these stakeholders to begin onboarding them, and you're not completely starting from scratch with them. They haven't been completely left in the dark on this process and are just being looped in. They were very heavily involved throughout the RFP. They know what's going on. They've been introduced to you and your company, your capabilities. So you're not necessarily starting from scratch. I think that's another thing that's valuable as well, when looping
in
others.
Yeah, and when the some of the stakeholders put in their requirements, of course they had specific upcoming projects in mind, right? There were a few things, high visibility, high priority things coming up pretty quick, right? Like, and I know we're jumping ahead now, but like right after you guys started with us, there was this high level, homepage relaunch, if you remember.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah.
No pressure or anything, just a few weeks into onboarding. Here's our most visible content. Can you please turn it around in 2 weeks? Always makes things fun. So, end to end, I won't dive into the process too much and timelines. I don't know that there's a whole lot to cover there. If I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, the full process, you joined Smartsheet in November. The RFP went out in end of January, and then by May 1st, I think, is when we first started that onboarding process.
Yeah, so I'm looking at my cheat sheet here to make sure I get this right. So yeah, I started at the end of November, you could say December 1st. So then my first month at Smartsheet, of course, was all about getting to know, the internal stakeholders. And I used, the RFP planning process in parallel with getting to know the stakeholders, as we talked about at the very beginning. Right, Sarah, the RFP went out in late January, and then we gave time until early March to submit the written responses. Might sound like a long time frame. I'm not sure I don't think there's any standards, right, in terms of response time frames.
Yeah, we see everything. We get some where it's, you need to turn this around in 2 weeks. And then we get some where the buyer is like, you have a full month to turn this around. But and I think the expectation is higher too, that, you better show up with a really detailed proposal crafted specifically to that customer if you've had a full month to work on it and to think through these things.
Yeah.
I would say the main takeaway here is that this isn't, going through this process. It's not something that's going to be solved and answered in just a few short weeks. Take your time, slow down the process, give vendors time to respond.
Exactly.
Take your time to meet with them. As much as it was kind of grueling going through that mock project process, I do think that was very valuable, not only for us, a little bit about what you guys were looking for, but really so you can kind of test out the process for yourself. So from my point of view, if there's a new buyer going through this, it's take your time to do this, because once you select a vendor, you we're spot on earlier that you're going to be working with this person every day. It's almost like a colleague that you're bringing on board, and you want to make sure that you're selecting the right one.
It's like a hiring process, right? You never want to rush things, even though it sometimes feels brutal for the candidates who wait for an answer. But going back to the timeline, just as a takeaway for other buyers here. So our timeline, so the responses were due in March, and then the orals were over a time frame at the end of March. It was very compact for us because we had 5 presentations. I don't think it was in 1 week, but I think within a week and a half. So then at the end of March, we basically looking at the scorecards then, we were done with the scorecards at that point. It was down to 2 vendors. And then we did the mock projects in March, right? Like an end-to-end dummy handoff, dummy translation, not a test translation, but just like filling out the content with machine translation, sending it back. So do the full round trip, including the quoting at the very beginning, and a mock invoice at the end. So really, I think that was very valuable.
Yeah, and not only just from the LSP side, but that gave you an opportunity to test out the project process with the TMS as well.
Exactly, and at that, so and at that time we were also looking at 2 different platforms still. Like we hadn't decided yet on which platform we would acquire. So the mock projects, we did it with both platforms actually. We send content through both platforms. So that gave us another good insight into which platform would work better for our needs.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very valuable. Just wrapping up the timeline here. So then 2 vendors by the end of March, we had to make a decision between the 2 of them. There were no more scorecards at that point. It was just like, who did better with the mock projects, basically.
Yeah.
And then mid-April is when we informed the winner, which was obviously Welocalize. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking today. We officially kicked off. We officially then kicked off May 1st. We kicked off the onboarding process, and then the first project's going live June 1st.
Yeah.
So you see, it's we're talking January through June, which sounds like a long time, but I think it also became clear how much there was involved actually throughout the process. So it's not something you can just do, oh, let's get an RFP going, and in 2 weeks we have a new vendor up and running. It just doesn't work that way.
Now you brought up onboarding and how we kind of kicked off May 1st. Now that you have been through that process in onboarding a new vendor, are there any learnings that you would take away from that and advice that you would give to a buyer who has just begun a partnership with a new vendor, and how to navigate that onboarding process?
Yeah, pretty simple. Plan ahead and, account for ample time. Again, this is not something you can do within 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Run it like a project, right? Like create a project plan. And we have this wonderful tool called Smartsheet that lets you really project management things very well. So we ran this whole thing as a waterfall project, right? It's not obviously an agile project, but yeah, like put together a project plan and set milestones you want to hit along the way. If you have a requirement to start at a certain date, like, if June 1st is the day you want to start, do a backwards work back schedule and see when you need to start. But really treat it as a project. Don't treat it like as something you can just do on the side and everything will automatically happen. Structure is very important. If you don't put together your requirements, then you will just get the generic sales pitch. And I don't think you need an RFP process for that. I mean, there's plenty of sales materials you can read for yourself. You don't need a process for that.
One thing that stood out to me with onboarding, we've actually have tried to replicate our onboarding with Smartsheet with other customers too, is, and this isn't a plug for the Smartsheet platform, but we used the platform to track, very detailed tasks of the onboarding process. What is the task that needs to be done? When is its due date? Who is the owner of this task? We could use that platform to communicate in comments directly about where that task sat. I really think that was incredibly valuable, getting down into those detailed tasks to keep everybody on track and also give everybody visibility on who owns what throughout this onboarding process.
Yeah.
Because it was a tight turnaround. I mean, we had 10 different divisions, I think, that we were onboarding once.
Yeah.
And that all needed to be done across a 1 month time span. So if it's a new buyer who's just come with a vendor, that's one thing that I would really, really emphasize that is important when going through the onboarding process is have very detailed tasks and milestones for that onboarding process that you need to accomplish. Know what those are ahead of time, put dates and owners to them, and then use that to hold yourself accountable. I think that was really, really valuable when we went through that onboarding process. Now, I know we're sorry, I know we are almost at time. So just to kind of wrap it up, one final question would be, thinking again, going back to this other people in your shoes, if you had maybe 2 to 3 tips for your peers on how to select a new provider and, learnings that you had through this process or things that you do different, would you mind sharing?
Yeah, and maybe I will walk backwards in time with the takeaways here, because you just mentioned the onboarding process, right? I think one of the lessons learned for myself and the team was we were probably a little too overambitious with the onboarding timeline. I think we threw everything at you from all the different teams at the same time. You mentioned 10 different teams, and they were all eager to get started. So as soon as we, we opened the floodgates, and then you were like bombarded from all sides with project needs. As a recommendation, I would say put yourself in the shoes of the vendor in that case. Think how it was for you when you started at a company, working at a company. Could you take on everything, all at once from day one?
Yeah.
No, of course not. You needed to focus on one thing and then work your way up. It's the same for a new supplier, right? Yeah. They don't know they don't know the inner workings of your company. So really just give them some time to digest all the things you are throwing at them. Don't throw everything at them at the same time. I think that's a really important takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, we made it work, right? But I do agree that perhaps prioritizing, maybe a rollout plan where you have, okay, these
Yeah.
teams are our largest budget holders. We are going to prioritize this work. Let's turn that on first. And then we're going to continue to get things rolled out with other stakeholders as well.
Yeah.
Maybe having
Well, we did have a rollout plan, but it was like rolling out everything at the same time.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's one thing. And then two things I already mentioned. I think I would want people to walk away if they take anything out of this conversation, right? Then there's two additional things. Really structure the RFP process. Run it as a project. Really, don't run it as something you do on the side. And then really document your requirements. I can't emphasize that enough. And I think one takeaway you can easily remember is if you create a generic requirements document, you get a very generic response, right? Like it's almost like this garbage in, garbage out. So make sure you take the time to document your requirements.
Okay.
And I think those three things I would really encourage people to remember if they start this journey. Have we done everything perfectly? Probably not, but I think overall the outcome was pretty satisfactory for all parties involved. Starting with our stakeholders felt like they were involved in the process. You guys felt you had everything in hand to do a proper response. And then, yeah, I'm happy with where we're at today.
Yeah, likewise. And I have to thank you, obviously, for inviting us and being willing to have this conversation today. Oh,
absolutely. I think it's great. Yeah.
On the selling side, in my experience, we learn from every RFP that we work on. Every RFP that we get a chance to participate in is a learning experience for how to deliver an even better customer experience. And it certainly was with Smartsheet. So kudos to you on a job well done there. It was fun for us, a fun ride, and we continue to look forward to our partnership next year.
Likewise.
Well, thank you, sir, for your time today. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.